So here's a quick overview of the controls in Blender to show you how you can use different tools to make something like a cube into something a bit more interesting, like a character. This isn't going to be how to make a character, it's going to just be the general controls that you need. First, I'll explain the controls as though you've got a mouse. I suggest you plug in a mouse if you've got one. It'll just make the whole thing a lot more simpler because it'll be familiar to you. Controls can be slightly different on a trackpad, and I'll talk about them in a moment. So, firstly, with a mouse, to zoom in, you scroll the scroll wheel, and that allows you to go in and out. If you hold the scroll wheel down like a button and move the mouse, you will orbit the scene, so we can move around our 3D object like this. And if you hold the shift key and press your scroll wheel like a button, you should be able to move around like this. This is called panning. If you're on a trackpad, you may find that pinching with two fingers or moving your fingers apart will zoom in and out. You might also find that two fingers on your trackpad will allow you to orbit, and again, holding shift and using two fingers on your trackpad will help you to pan. In order to make your trackpad work like this, it may be necessary to go to Edit, Preferences, and in the Input section, tick this button that says Emulate 3-button mouse. You can then save these preferences by clicking on this button and choosing Save Preferences, and then closing this window. And hopefully, using either a mouse or your trackpad, you're now able to control the screen. Initially, we're looking at this cube in what's called object mode. We can see which mode we're in up here on the top left. I can choose between object mode, edit mode, or some others, including sculpt, which we've looked at before. In object mode, we can move the whole object around the scene. We can rotate it, or we can scale it to make it larger or smaller. The shortcuts for these keys are G will allow us to move it, S will allow us to scale it up and down, and R will allow me to rotate it like this. As you can see, just pressing these keys on their own can lead to moving it in a sort of unforeseen ways. You're not always in full control. So we've got the X, Y, and Z keys, which can help us have a bit more control over it. Up here, we can see those axes, Z, X, and Y, and they're coloured in the same way that these lines are coloured here. So if I was to move it in the X axis, this red one, I would press G, then X, and I can move it around like that. If I were to rotate it in the X axis, you'll see R, then X, and I'm just tapping these keys, I'm not holding them down, and you can see that I can rotate that like that. If you want to rotate it very precisely, you can hold down Control, and if you look in the top left corner, I'll try and put my mouse there, you'll see that the degrees move around in 5-degree increments like that, so you can have a lot of control over your rotation. When you're happy with your new placement or scale or rotation, you can just click and that'll set that. So this is very good for treating the whole object when we want to move it around within the 3D world or add any modifiers or materials to it. The next thing we can do with this object is edit it. At the moment it's a very simple object, we can edit it to make it more complex. To edit this cube, we would go into edit mode by choosing it from this menu here. You can also press the tab key on your keyboard, which is usually directly above the caps lock key. In edit mode, we can access the vertices, these little dots on the corners. Up here, we've got 3 buttons. So at the moment we can see it's on vertices, and that's what we can select. We can either select one vertex by clicking it, or multiple by clicking and dragging over them, making sure that our box encompasses the black dots that represent the vertices. We can also select edges. So again, I can click on a single edge, or if I hold down the Shift key, I can select multiple edges. And if I click and drag over them, again, I can select multiple edges. You can see here that I've selected all 4 edges around a face, and so it's highlighted that. Once I've got an edge selected, or edges, again I can press G or S or R. Again, if I wanted to, I could press X or Y or Z to constrict its movement within a particular axis. The third option we have is face select. Instead of clicking on these, you can press 1, 2 and 3. When you've got face mode selected, you can click on a face, or again hold Shift to select multiple faces, or drag select to select multiple faces. And the same applies, we can scale or rotate or move them. You will notice that if I turn around here, whilst it looks from one angle that I might have selected all of the faces, in fact I haven't. Any of the faces that were hidden from me in this view haven't been selected. This is sometimes and usually quite useful so that we don't end up selecting faces that are at the back of our object, because normally we're sort of moving around it like this and selecting the bits and then working on them. But if you do need to select those back faces, what you do is you go up to this little button here, these 2 overlapping squares, and turn on X-ray mode. And you can see now that we can see through our shape, and I can actually select by clicking and dragging all of those faces, even if they're facing away from me. A quick way to select all of our object or deselect all of our object is using the A key. If I haven't got anything selected, or if I've got one face selected or something like that, I can press A to select the whole lot. If I've got anything selected, either everything or just a couple of faces or whatever, I can double tap A and that will deselect everything. This is helpful when going around and working on little bits, so I can do something with that face, for example, and then I can either click on this face here, or I can double tap A and click on a new face, and then work on that. So, for example, that. Command and Z, or Control and Z if you're on a Windows computer, will allow you to undo. So make sure that you know, if you go wrong, use Command and Z, undo, and try again. You will only get so many undos before it won't go back any further. So use it wisely. While in edit mode, we can do several things to our object. So starting with faces, firstly I can move this face. So as I said before, if I press G and Z, I can do this sort of thing. But often in edit mode, we want to add more faces so that we can add more detail to our object. One way of doing that is to extrude a face. If I select a face and choose E, I can then move that upwards, and you'll see that it hasn't scaled it upwards, it's added a new face. This is good because I've now got this extra face here that I can, move out here, and we can start to build our object, whatever it might be. One thing that you'll see a lot of modelers do is extruding and then scaling. So you can imagine how this might be used to, describe the form of a body, for example. An arm might go in at the elbow and then widen at the forearm and widen at the shoulder. And so we can recreate those sorts of shapes. So use scaling to get a sense of the lines of the object. As well as extruding, we can make more faces by using Inset. To use this, we press I, and that allows us to make a smaller face within the one we'd previously selected. And again, I can move that up, for example. That might form the basis of a house, for example. If I was to then extrude it, you can see how this might become something like a lamppost or a skyscraper. And by using a combination of those two, you can create lots of different forms. The third most common way to add faces is what's called a loop cut. And the tool is actually called Loop Cut and Slide, and it can be found here. I should probably have said that Extrude is here, Inset is here, and this is the Loop Cut. Okay, you can see it says cut mesh loop and slide it. And what that means is that if I press Control and R, or indeed this button, when I hover over my cube, you'll see that depending on which edge I hover over, it will produce a different yellow preview line of the cut that it thinks I want to make. And depending on where I need the faces, so if I wanted to make this cube wider, I could perhaps do it around the center like this. I'm going to click like that, and you'll see that that sets the edge around the shape like that. If I click again, it places it directly in the center of this line and this line, so it always produces a new edge in between the existing ones. I can now scale these, for example. And again, that's just helping me get more faces to add more detail to my object. As well as putting it in the center, we can also slide it, hence the slide in the name of the tool. So I'm going to press Control and R, and this time I'll do a vertical cut by hovering over this horizontal edge, and it creates the loop cut over the top of the object like that. And this time I'll click once, and it gives me the opportunity to slide it along. You know, perhaps I need the faces to be in a certain location, so I can use that to produce those faces that I need. Then I can switch to face mode, and I can start to edit these as I need to. I'm just going to turn off X-ray mode so we can see what we're doing a bit easier. Okay, so Inset, Extrude and Loop Cut and Slide are really some of the main tools to get to grips with for this project. Once you're happy with the shape of your object, this is a totally random thing that I just made, it's not supposed to be anything. You can go back out into object mode, and again you can press tab to do that, and I can press G and X or G and Y or whatever to position that in the 3D world. To help us add more complexity easily to our objects, that is without us having to make too detailed a mesh, we can use modifiers. This spanner over here will allow you access to the modifier menu, where you can choose from a list of all sorts of things. So they've got quite descriptive names. You know, you can try a few out, see what they do. They might end up looking pretty crazy, but you know, that's what it's all about. Have a look what they do, and you know, you might find something that really helps you out. For example, subdivision surface is a very commonly used one, and you can see that that smooths out the object. It creates curves where there were previously boxes. You'll also see now that in edit mode, and you'll see this with most of the modifiers, that it presents you with the original mesh and the kind of modified version. This makes it really easy to just make adjustments without having to deal with lots of faces. So I could, for example, just, you know, G and then X to extend that bit. Also in this mode, it gives me a better sense of how the final object will look. And this is where using loop cut and slide and some of those other methods really comes into its own. If I press Control and R, for example, you'll see that the left side of this shape over here looks very pointy. But what if I want it to look firmer? I would use loop cut and slide. As you can see, I've got my preview cut going around it like this. Click, and then I can move that in and out. So if I was making an aeroplane, it might be something like this. You know, a sleeve might be more like this, and so on. If I add another one here, you'll see if I scale that, it makes quite a difference to the shape of the mesh. If I scale it just in the y-axis by pressing S and Y, you'll see that I can thin it out a bit as well. So you've got a lot of control over the shape. You just have to think about which direction you're scaling it in or where you're moving it to. Also, think carefully about where you add cuts. Try not to add too many. Just use the ones that you need to really describe the shape best. As I say, there are lots of other modifiers that do different things. This one, for example, remesh, is quite an interesting one. Column C, you might be interested in this. If I apply the remesh modifier, you'll see it here. I'll just expand this window a little. You can see, if I go into object mode, I've just pressed tab to go into object mode. Here, I can mess around with these settings, and it will change the sort of style of my mesh. This is actually making it much sharper. Instead of sharpness, I can change it to some of these things. So blocks, for example, will do this and create a kind of voxel art type thing. And again, if I just change these, you'll see it. There we go. It changes the level of detail, which is quite cool. Might not be appropriate for everyone, but this is what I mean. Explore these modifiers and see what they do. Some might end up in a completely crazy mesh or do absolutely nothing. You know, that sort of thing. But it's worth trying and having a little explore. To remove a modifier, as you can see, you just press this little X here. And also, one thing to note with the Subdivision surface modifier, which again is really commonly used, you can adjust its quality in these settings here. Try not to go too high. It will crash your computer. The more faces we have in an object, the more detailed it is, and the harder it makes the computer work. You'll notice that we can still see the faces on this object. That might be desirable, but it might not be, in which case in the object menu here we can choose shade smooth, and that gives us this really sort of polished look. As well as modifiers and the myriad other things you can do in Blender, one of the most common things to do is add materials. This button here allows us to do that. It's got a basic material on here, but you might also see this button, in which case you can just press new, and it will set you up with a basic material where you can give it a colour or certain settings to make it more metallic or shiny or whatever. Again, have a play with them. You'll notice that even though I've changed the colour, it hasn't changed the colour here. So what we do is we have to change our view mode. There are 4 view modes. The first one is wireframe. This gives us an overview of the mesh. It's also the least intensive on the computer. So it might be difficult to work with, but if your computer is a bit slow, then this will help you work more quickly. And then only try and use these last 2 buttons when you really need to. The next one, also not too intensive on the computer, is what's called solid mode, where everything's grey. You can get a good idea of the shape of things and the position of things, but you can't see any of the materials. The next one is called look dev, or material preview, and you can see that it's got the colour and it's got some lighting and things on there, but it's not like a final rendered version. This is really useful because it gives us a really good preview of what our final thing will look like without, again, being massively taxing on the computer. But it is more taxing on the computer than these first 2 options. The final mode, if you can actually do it, is rendered. And what we do is we press that, and you'll see that this has now got much more realistic shading on and gives us a real sense of what our object might look like in the end. This is the most intensive process that you can do in Blender. Just a note on these viewports that if you haven't, just check your settings in this little menu here with what looks like the back of a DSLR camera, and make sure that your render engine is set to Eevee, as cycles will make it work harder. Obviously, if you're familiar with different render engines, I'm thinking of you, Alex, then you can make that decision. to work in Eevee or Cycles. Have a go, I mean, see how it looks, but you can see Cycles just takes a bit more time to get that rendering done, and when I move around it's a bit sketchy for a moment until it sort of sorts itself out. Whereas in Eevee it's much more fluid and you don't get that sketchiness. Don't forget to save files, okay? File, save as, and when you get the box up, you know, I think yours might look different to mine, but make sure you're not putting the file name in where the folder path is. Actually do it in this box here and give it a decent name. So there's lots more to explore in Blender, and I dare say you'll find a few problems along the way, but that's no reason not to do it. One thing that does occur to me is sometimes zooming in and out can become quite challenging, and it feels like the more you zoom, or no matter how much you zoom, you don't go anywhere. In which case, what you can do is sort of reset the view by going to View and Frame All, and that will just sort of reset everything and hopefully allow you to move around more easily. Alternatively, you can click on a single object like this and go to View, Frame Selected, and that will put that object at the sort of center of the world. So you see, as I orbit round and scale and whatnot, it keeps that object pretty central. You can also do that with individual vertices and faces if you really want to get into the nitty-gritty of it. So if I click this face in edit mode and go to View, Frame Selected, you'll see it brings that into focus, which is really handy. So obviously more tutorials to follow, but hopefully this will provide a useful reference, and the new tutorials as well will be more specific to particular things, but also with audio now that I've turned my microphone on.